Welcome back to another episode of I Am Changing. In today's podcast episode, I'd like to talk and pose a couple of questions, namely about your container. Is your container too small? And by this I mean, are you limiting yourself in order to fit in with your life? When we talk about a container, we have obviously a physical vessel, that's our body. But if you were to sit in the middle of the room and close down your eyes and almost go into like a bit of meditation and just breathe in, connect into your heart and fill that room with emotions, that's the vessel of your emotions, your emotional vessel or container. And then if you were to imagine that your soul could fit into that space of your entire home, this is the container of spirit, of your soul. So when we talk about containers and where we fit, these are things that we can actually modify. Whilst it's a little harder to modify our physical, energetically, vibrational energetics means that we can expand or contract our metaphorical container based on where we are. And I was reading a really interesting article the other day on LinkedIn, and the questions that I came up with, and it became a little bit of a story that I ended up journaling out, was, well, let me ask you this. When was the last time you squeezed yourself back into a container? And I'm not talking about your skinny jeans and how you squeeze yourselves into them, but that metaphor is actually quite useful. So you eat your whole pizza and the skinny jeans are a little tight the next day, whereas if you eat really well and exercise, your skinny jeans should look and fit perfectly. But what I'm talking about here is that metaphor of when was the last time you limited yourself in order to fit in? And it might have been a social situation, a moment of awkward conversation, or perhaps when you last experienced a moment of conflict. Let me ask you this. When was the last time you dimmed your light so as not to shine too brightly? Because let's face it, sometimes that keeps you safe, just flying under the radar, going with the flow, going with what everyone else is doing, because God forbid you don't want to speak up and outshine the popular girl, right? Perhaps it could be, when did you last draw attention to yourself? And let me ask you, how did that make you feel? Was that something that was really positive, or was that a not so positive experience? And we can thank social media for becoming quite complacent about showing up in our lives and honouring the container that we live in. You know, we crave these tiny little hits of dopamine that we get from the likes and the numbers on our Instagram accounts, yet we suffer anxiety from ignoring all of the signals that our physical, emotional, and spiritual containers give us. It's so easy to become trapped in the vortex of comparing yourself to others. It's really easy to ignore that intuitive voice inside you, just override, pretend it didn't happen, and just simply do what everyone else is doing and fit in. And let's face it, it's easy to make your container smaller. It takes a much more conscious effort to make your container larger. So, did you come up with an answer of where do you limit yourself in order to fit in? And I'm circling back to this article by Loretta Hart on LinkedIn the other day, which really resonated strongly. She was sharing the story of coaching a young woman to prepare for a podcast interview. And this woman was quite nervous. And to encourage this person, Loretta asked her, so if you had loads of women in a room and you could share one message with them, what would that be? And it's an obvious coaching question where you invite someone to light up their heart and talk about their passion, because theoretically that's quite non-threatening and it lights people up. And Loretta talks about how the young person's response, without any hesitation, blew her mind. And I have to say, I felt the same way. I read the article 3 times because it just lit me up from the inside. And the answer was if you had loads of women in a room and you could share with them one message, what would that be? And the answer was, take up space. And those 3 words got me thinking about how we limit ourselves. And it got me thinking about the neural pathways and the psychology of why we limit ourselves. Because let's face it, our human experience dictates what we want to feel safe. We actively seek out love and acceptance with families and our friendship circles and even at work. That psychology of wanting to feel safe and fit in extends even to the entrepreneur who craves the likes and the numbers growing on their business pages. However, when we seek validation outside of ourselves, this actually disconnects us from what lights us up. It's like we're giving someone else permission to define our worth and deservability. And so what happens is we uncouple from what excites us, and this reduces the size of our feelings container, our heart space. And when we limit that container of the heart space, we're actually limiting our capacity to express ourselves. And when we don't express what's felt in the heart, we can migrate our energy up into our head, and this is where we become stuck. This is where the negative outlook begins to fester. And additionally, when we don't express our feelings, we're actually reducing the energy we can feel, and we go into overwhelm by the sheer volume of thoughts. And so it doesn't have anywhere to go except around and around, building and building and building. And this is actually how procrastination via mind-numbing activities begins, like social media or TV. We look for things to numb all of the thoughts, and so we blank out or numb ourselves. And when we limit our exploration of life and new experiences, we develop an internal sense of agitation. We can become anxious. And this makes relationships in turn really challenging because we've reduced our capacity to articulate how we're feeling, how we're thinking, and our ability to negotiate on our own behalf. And so let me wrap up today's very short session with, where do you limit yourself in order to fit in with the situation? Or do you take up space and honour the magical unicorn that you really are? And perhaps that leaves me with the final question, and it's more important, is what have you diluted in your life to reduce the size of your container by limiting yourself? It's a powerful question and something I invite you to reflect on, because if you could acknowledge the boundaries of where you limit yourself, you might then ask yourself, well, do I still fit into this container, or do I need to take up space?